Welcome to The Great Exchange, a podcast about examining the lies that we believe and exchanging them for God's truth. I'm your host, Brady Cohn, and joining me today is my friend, Mick Thornton. How are you doing today, Mick?
I'm good, Brady. Can I start off by telling a story about you, Brady? Is
Absolutely.
that cool?
We love stories.
Right on. So this probably happened, I'm going to say 11 years ago. Maybe as many as 13 years ago. So I was a senior pastor of this church in Ainsworth, a couple years in, and we were growing. Things were going pretty good. And you and I had met recently, and one way or another, I called you in to speak on really short notice, like 3 days notice, 4 days notice, something. And you came in and you spoke, and I'd never even heard you speak at that point, and I didn't hear you then. I wasn't there. That's why I called you in. And I get back the next week or the next couple days later, whatever, and it's like this little firestorm. People,
I stirred things up.
Yeah, people are calling me. I got all these messages, and then people are like, "How dare you have a gay guy come speak at our church?" and all this stuff, and I'm just like, what happened? So I went back and I listened to your message, and it was magnificent. A part of the message you spoke out of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and there's this, it's the passage is about conflict, and it's talking about, people not, sinners not inheriting the kingdom of God. And it gives this list of, drunkards and thieves and homosexuals and different things. And then at the end of it, it says, and that is what some of you were, but you were washed, you were justified, you were sanctified. And I was moved, and what actually happened through that whole process is, as leadership, we decided to take a stand, because what we realized is that our church was living in a fantasy world, where on the one hand, people talked like they wanted to be about Jesus, and they talked like they wanted to see other people come to Jesus and that sort of thing. But what they really wanted is for people to deal with their junk and then come to Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not how Jesus works. So from that little messy moment, people left the church, and we set a direction, like a committed direction, that as a church, we were going to meet, love, and serve people exactly where they were. That we were going to put forth no expectations that you had to know this or start doing that or stop doing that before you show up here, before you connect with us. And what followed was a decade or so of really fruitful ministry. And
that's amazing.
And one of the linchpins of that was your authenticity that day, and that's something I've always appreciated about you.
That's so awesome. I remember that so well, because that was really one of the first churches I spoke at about a very difficult topic of homosexuality and sharing my story and how are people going to respond. And I so much remember you wrestling through that and just having my back. And I remember someone in your church said, this type of thing shouldn't be talked about in church. And you said, well, it's in the Bible, so we should probably talk about it in church. And there was another, I don't know if you remember some of these specifics. This is really ingrained in my mind, because this was a big moment where someone in your church told you that she just couldn't come to the grips with the fact that I'm forgiven. And that comment has stood with me all these years. And it's like, do you know the gospel? Do you know Jesus? And how many years and decades have you been sitting in this church, and yet you can't come to grips with the fact that this person who repented of their sin is forgiven because it's different than your sin? And that stuck with me. But also what stuck with me was the shift that happened in your church and the way that you guys, which you didn't, maybe you didn't have to go bad for me, because I wasn't really involved. I got to go speak, and then I went home, so I didn't have to deal with anything afterwards. But the way that you shepherded your church through that, even when it meant some people leaving, but you said, we're going to be about Jesus and people finding Jesus and people being transformed by Jesus. And so please join us in that mission. Otherwise, this might not be a good place for you. And paraphrasing, I might say, but I remember that shift in you guys, and it was so encouraging to me. And I think that part of that kept me going on, like, man, there is something happening in small town churches that I can be a part of, and I can be a part of them taking the next step. And that really helped propel me to next season of ministry, where I think that God can do something with this.
It was
so the encouragement goes both ways.
Well, thank you, Brady. I appreciate that. I consider it an honor that I've been able to be an encouragement to you.
Thank you. So you are no longer pastor of a small town church, but you now work with kids dealing with trauma. So tell us a little bit about your job and dealing with trauma.
Sure. So, long story short, I started working in more of a sort of an educational grant-funded environment a couple of years ago in a different state, and then the pandemic happened. So we're trying to figure out how to continue to serve kids when schools are shut down and everything. And we ended up getting a couple of grants through that state's Department of Corrections, and what we decided to do, rather than typical corrective action, rather than getting more ankle bracelets on kids, getting more punitive responses to try to control people's negative behaviors, what we decided to do is we decided to help kids process their junk. Because one of my life maxims is that in life, either you deal with your junk or your junk is going to deal with you. So
Absolutely.
We made some partnerships that were really built around that idea. We connected with a group that has really functioned from that perspective for about 30 years in the environment of batterers intervention. So they help people who hurt the people that they're supposed to love the most. And we modified this process to serve kids in the criminal justice system. And in a nutshell, what we do is we help kids find a new story. And it's been...
I love that.
It's been amazing work. We work with kids who have done just your regular, ordinary, dumb kid things. And we work with kids who are fresh out of incarceration, who have done, like horrific things to other people. And the thread that comes up time and time again is that we never meet a kid who's got bad stuff coming out of them, who hasn't before that had a whole lot of bad stuff poured into them. So it's
Absolutely.
really, that's the space we work in. It is messy every single day, and the truth is it's glorious.
Yeah. I love what you said about none of these kids have bad stuff coming out of them without having bad stuff going into them, because as a child, other people are writing your story for you. You don't have control over so much what's happening, so other people are writing your story, and now you have an opportunity to help kids rewrite their story, realize that's not who I am, that's not who I have to be, there can be a different story. And it's so amazing you're able to do that in such a kind of public context as kids prison or whatever you call it, the criminal justice system, because that's gospel ministry. Like Jesus, over and over again, he went to someone and he said, this no longer has to be your story. The woman at the well, this is your story. Part of it written by other people, part of it by you, but there can be a different story. Now go from here and write a different story. And so your ministry has gospel all over it with troubled kids, and I love that.
It's been a tremendously healing season for me to do this work, which I did not necessarily expect. So some more background. So we clearly have history together. We've known each other and done ministry together for a long time. One of the undersides of that story is that the entire time that we were doing that, I was carrying a dark story, and for the first chunk of it, I didn't even know that I was carrying this story, and so I grew up in a situation where I was very loved by my parents, and and they were absolutely doing their best in essentially shifting from a place of generational poverty to a steady middle class, upwardly mobile kind of a thing, and they were working themselves to death doing that. And the other part of that story is at that same time I had a very abusive older brother, and my older brother, he's in jail right now on his way back to prison again. He has fetal alcohol syndrome and lots of stuff going on there. They adopted him when he was days old and have invested their lives in loving and caring for him. But in the midst of that experience of sort of being this kind of golden, unexpected child who was smart and who could do things, could read, could whatever it was, and also being this abused kid in an environment that was secret, that people didn't know, kind of the two sides of my life. I developed a story about me, and the story that I came to believe is that I was worthless, that the things that I accomplished were profoundly important. To get degrees and hang them on your wall is profoundly important. To preach great sermons and make a difference in people's lives, these things are profoundly important. But I was doing all of that from a position of worthlessness. So even in those,
you were consumed with shame, because shame tells us. Shame doesn't tell us that that's something that you've done or something that's happened to you, but that's who you are.
Exactly.
Shame speaks to us and becomes part of our identity. It makes the things that have been done who we are instead of something outside of us. It becomes internalized. So you were really consumed with shame, and you didn't even realize it for many years.
I didn't, so much so that during that phase that we're talking about, the church is exploding. We're hiring new staff. We're serving people in the community and around the world in ways that we didn't think were even going to be possible from our little chunk of, the middle of nowhere. All this amazing stuff is happening. And I remember I would sit in my big office behind my giant corner desk, awash in fear. And I finally was able through prayer and counsel and therapy, I came to understand that my fear was that this moment was going to happen and somebody was going to walk in my door and they were going to say, "We figured you out." Like, we see you. That
we
underneath,
see what's inside.
Right, underneath the great things that you do and the degrees on your wall and these rows of books on your shelves, like behind all of it is just you. And why would we want you? And I was consumed by this unnamed fear, this shame, this false guilt, and really as much as the outside story of that decade was about the privilege of participating in some pretty fruitful ministry, the inside story of that decade was about really having to walk in darkness and to come back and see things about myself that I did not want to see, to acknowledge things that I felt that I didn't want to feel, and to learn to meet Jesus in there, which is key because back to our previous thing we were talking about, as long as you're in an environment where you have this pre-built idea that other people are not okay for Jesus until they get to a certain level, the other side of that is that you don't believe that about yourself either.
Absolutely.
So
and that's so much of evangelical church, in Western America, is clean yourself up enough and then you're okay for Jesus.
Right. So we create these spiraling circles of inauthenticity.
Yeah. And secrets and darkness and walls and different compartments. And then the things inside those different compartments, they grow and they fester and they occupy more and more of our mind. And when we keep secrets and keep things compartmentalized, it affects us deeply and affects the people around us deeply because we can't process and see the world and really minister out of a place of peace and wholeness, like God would have us. And we can't model that to the people that God's given us influence over.
Right.
A model of wholeness with Christ to where there doesn't have to be compartments and there doesn't have to be anything left back,
Right.
because God wants all of me as I am right now, and
Right.
and I am. His grace is sufficient for every dark compartment that I've hidden in there.
So during that same time, I start, because I've always had a pastoral counseling part of my ministry. It's just true to who I am and how people meet me. People for decades of my life have come to me with the darkest parts of themselves. I don't know if it's a gift or it's a curse, but it's just a part of being who I am. Mm-hmm. And especially as Pastor Mick, that those floodgates were really open, and I'd spend, I don't know how many hours I've spent with people telling me things that they've never told anybody, just walking into darkness. And I discovered a trend, and the trend went like this: like people would come to me, and we would be able to talk together and really look into sort of the hallways of their brokenness, the hallways of their inner selves. And there were these rooms that were full of very dark things. Very often it was sexual brokenness, and that's interesting considering how much we don't talk about that in average ordinary church. But lots of different kinds of brokenness, all just surrounded by shame and usually false guilt and lots of stuff. And the trend, though, that I discovered that was so interesting to me is that here's what people wanted. They wanted me to help them to take that corner of their hearts and like block it up like you would a
fortify
room
it
in your
even
house,
more.
right? Like that you would block it up and create like this perfect facade over the front of it so that they could invite people into their hearts, and that person would never know that room was even there. That's what people were asking of me. And I realized that in a very real sense, that was exactly the story, the lie that I was trying to live out. I was trying to live out a lie that I was okay in ways that I was not okay. So
and you're living in fear of people finding one of those rooms.
Exactly.
If they open the right door.
Right. What if they walk around and they're knocking on the walls and they're like, hey, this is hollow back here. What's going on here? And it was such a beautiful season for me as I began to realize that that's not what God has for us. That's not what the walking in the truth of Jesus and the healing of the Spirit looks like. What it actually looks like is walking with God into that darkness and saying to Jesus, can you love me from here? And if you can, how are you going to heal this? What can you possibly do to make this right, to make this whole? And it turns out that once that happens, that's the room of our heart that we are most excited to show people. We're most excited to walk into our own lives and say, look what God has done. Look at the brokenness that has been healed. And when we do that in ourselves, we cease to be the kind of people who need other people to clean up their junk before they can come to us and hear about the whole Jesus situation. It just evaporates. That whole view of life simply evaporates.
Absolutely. Where do you think that theology / attitude comes from of, I still have these secrets in my own life, but I'm sitting in church every week. I'm kind of probably a little bit of self-righteousness because I have to pretend like things are together. And so I feel, is it that people feel threatened by someone walking inside the doors who doesn't have it together? What is it that's the threat that we feel inside the church of the still messy people out there that we need them to be cleaned up before they can step close to us? What is it that's behind that anxiety, that self-righteousness, that threat of we can't be exposed to these people?
Right. I think it comes from two places. The one is that until I'm okay with me, I can never be okay with you. Mm-hmm. And the more that your struggle and hardship is visible to me, then the more my own guilt, my own shame, and my own darkest story is triggered. Mm-hmm. I think that's a lot of it, that it comes with it comes with all this fear and all this shame that doesn't emanate from you. It's not like you're the source of it and it hits me. It's just the opposite of that.
Yeah.
We act like that, but it emanates from inside of me. There's something about you that reminds me of things that I don't want to be reminded of. So I think that part of it is this view of self issue, and the other part of it is the view of the church, that we crave this. I'm going to say this place, but I don't just mean brick and mortar walls. We crave this place of purity, this place where life actually makes sense, where black is black and white is white, and there is no gray. We crave that because we live in such complexity and such messiness in all of life, and
we want to escape the messiness.
Exactly, and I think for many of us, what we want our churches to be is we want them to be imaginary. We want them to be a Disney movie. We want them to be, we want them to be a sitcom where we show up and in some sort of humorous and predictable enough but also unpredictable enough sort of way, we show up and there's a problem and we go through this emotional experience together of resolution, and we know every week that when we get there that whatever the problem is, before we leave there's going to be a solution and we're all going to feel great about it.
Yeah, we're going to hug and we're going to feel so good, and now we
Right.
can go on with the rest of our week because we've had our fill of escaping the chaos and escaping the unknown, and this is predictable and this is known and this is comfortable.
Right, but if somebody shows up in need of a miracle, then the whole thing's wrecked. Because we didn't see a miracle last week. We saw a very manageable process, and that's not a bad thing necessarily. But what we didn't see a miracle. So when somebody shows up and they are carrying on their person, like just in their experience of life, more hardship than we are capable of dealing with, more hardship than we want to acknowledge exists in the world out there that we came to get away from, more struggle than our entire benevolence fund could deal with just for 1 week, right? When people start showing up and that's the experience, it in a very real way, it throws off our groove. And we have to decide, what is it that we're really here for? So to me, it's those two poles. The one is that when somebody messy comes into my theoretically pure space, then it triggers me. And the other is it messes up my vision of what this thing is really supposed to be. And that's the issue when you first came and spoke at our church. That was the issue that most came to the table, is that many people had a false view of what church was supposed to be. And in not too polite terminology, there's this thought of church that says, no. I come here to get away from those people.
And part of it is I'm one of those people because I have these secrets, these compartments, and church is a place where I can pretend like they're not there. So I'm not escaping from those people around me in everyday life. I'm escaping from myself and entering into this fantasy world.
Yep. Which is exactly why it doesn't work. Which is exactly why church becomes this hollow shell of a thing, and over time it tends to fail at the mission that we have attached to it, because the mission that we attached to it was built on false premises to begin with.
It was not about miracles from Jesus in people's lives.
Right. And then it gets more complicated than that, because what if you show up to church on Sunday with cancer? And what if you leave and you still got cancer? What if you show up on Sunday and everything's great, and on Tuesday your child dies in a car wreck on the way to school, and on Friday or Saturday we have a funeral for that child, and then Sunday rolls back around? Like, what if the mess from every human perspective really is unmanageable? What if we live on this razor's edge of horror, and it is true all of the time? What does that do to the story?
Absolutely.
And the answer is it does one of two things. It either drives you away from church, from Jesus as you know him, or it drives you towards Jesus for who he actually is.
Yes, to the real Jesus.
And if we have spent our lives setting up barriers that are really essentially designed to avoid walking in the real truth of Jesus, of who Jesus is, both with ourselves and with other people, when those moments come, we're in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, because we don't have the foundation to process, to the spiritual maturity to deal with it, to process, to evaluate, to see it rightly. And then when we don't have healing ourselves, then we're threatened by so many different things. We don't have a category for how this can happen. And we don't have a file to put this somewhere that makes sense, because this isn't the way it was supposed to be. Because we're living in this little fantasy where I could keep this darkness closed away.
Yep. And it's heartbreaking because we don't have to. Mm-hmm. Because there's this entirely different story that is also true and available to us, that we can walk with the real Jesus in the midst of real life, whoever we are and whatever life brings. And that is a fundamentally different experience. I'll tell you a word that comes up to me time and time again as I work with kids who have been through just the most horrific crap imaginable, and then come to me because people are just mad at them for the stuff that they're doing. The word is objectification. And I think that both in my work that I'm doing right now, particularly, which is serving traumatized people, but also in my broader mission as a person who walks with Jesus and is committed to walking with Jesus in all parts of my life. And I think also in the targeted work that you're doing, which is more and more focused in the area of, sexuality, human sexuality, and particularly homosexuality, that's a key word, objectification. Because
let's unpack that some.
Sure. At the core of all trauma, I'm going to say at the core of most trauma, at the core of all interpersonal trauma, there is a kernel of objectification. Because if I am going to inflict harm upon you for my benefit, the only way I can do that is to see you as an object, not as a subject. Right? Mm-hmm. And likewise, if I'm going to
dehumanize someone,
they're
exactly, a thing and not a person,
or if I'm just simply going to use you for my benefit without regard to you, right? Whether that be a kind of neglect, where I withhold from you things to which you are entitled, or whether that be a kind of abuse where I just don't care about you, right? Fundamental to all of those experiences is dehumanization / objectification. The idea that I am in that moment not in a subject to subject interaction, but a subject to object interaction. Mm-hmm. And if you think about that, go ahead.
How do you feel like that? How does that develop in someone's life? Does it become a deeper and deeper hard-heartedness to where over time they have to, block out their conscience, block out God's voice, and hide more and more, and continue to feed the idols that they're serving, and therefore people become more and more objectified? Because one of the things I was just thinking of is that I used to do work with human trafficking organizations, and some of the worst objectification and dehumanizing of people were little girls in Mexico who were being sex trafficked. And I seen them, I experienced them, I got to minister to them. I don't talk about that very much because it's still, some of those memories are painful for me to even process and talk about. And when I was in Mexico doing that, it was mostly American men who were coming down and going to the brothels and paying, an X amount of money to be with a 7-year-old girl. And I've spent years trying to process that, and like, what gets someone to that point? I'm sure that person did not wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm going to go to Mexico today and pay for a 7-year-old girl. But it starts somewhere and takes people somewhere where they never imagined it would take them. And so where can you help us sort out that dehumanization of people, that objectification of people, that the story that's told that gets someone to that place where I'm sure that they never intended to go?
First off, I would say that the piece you're talking about, the component where we are experiencing guilt, shame, irritation, anger at ourselves as we kind of fall deeper and deeper and deeper into whatever this thing is, I think that's a very real experience. I don't think it's the primary, or it's not the primary experience. It's not the first mover experience. The first mover is that objectification is a worldview, and we are all awash in it. Right? Like, I don't know, choose your TV personality. That person is an object to millions of people, not a subject.
Yes.
Right. Choose your and then think about the way that we treat one another, particularly because we live in a very politically charged left versus right kind of environment.
I was just thinking about that. The dehumanization I see regarding any political conversation, and social media is the worst. And it's like the way that people are interacting with each other over a political disagreement. You would think that this, like, how could you possibly say that to another human? But to do that, you have to dehumanize them on they are an object that is in the way of what I want.
Right. And if you are a person who regularly talks about people in categories like the rhinos, the libs, the whatever, then one of the things you need to understand about yourself is that you are participating in the exact same worldview of that 44-year-old businessman from Bismarck who flies down to Tijuana twice a year to this child brothel. The worldview is fundamentally the same. And the idea is that there's a person out there who matters less than you do for X reason. They matter less in the political conversation. They matter less than you do because you're right and they're wrong. Right?
Yes.
And they're gonna, because they're so wrong that they're gonna somehow hurt you or destroy the country or whatever, right? But the story is exactly the same, right? Go back to even pick your war situation. One of the things that's common in any foxhole is some kind of racial slur towards whoever is in the other foxhole, because that
you have to
enables
dehumanize them if you're gonna have the courage to shoot them.
Right, because that enables you to pop your gun up over the deal and plink a Charlie or whoever's over there, rather than you pointing a weapon of death at a human being. So objectification is first and foremost a worldview, and we are all awash in it. And until we as Christians become honest about that, we are never going to have fruitful ministry in objectified space. You cannot be a person who pathologically objectifies others and then be appalled at the way that somebody else pathologically objectifies others. Like, it doesn't work. We don't get to play by those rules as people of grace.
I see that in so many places in my life. It's like one of the things I struggle with is anger sometimes. Road rage. My wife gets so upset with me, and it's like, the other day, I'm embarrassed to tell this story. It's like I'm just driving down the highway in our little hometown, and someone's on my tail, and I see they honk. It's like, oh, I'm going like 1 mile an hour less than the speed limit, and the town is right there, so we're all gonna have to slow down. And so, but then it escalates to where I slow down to make them mad, and then they give me the finger. So then I'm like, have my hand in the back seat giving them the finger, and then they start to try to get around me, and as they're passing me, I just floor it. And we're headed towards, we're like half a mile from town of where there's going to be a stoplight, and the speed limit goes down to 25, and we're up to like 60 miles an hour, like him trying to get around me. We're both have our horns on. We both have fingers in the air. And it's like, what a horrible display. Like, I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed by how I respond, because this was not a human to me. This was a person that was interfering in my perfect world. Who, I have goals. I have things that just evolve. I want to evolve around me, and someone got in the way of that. Someone got in the way of my peace by honking and being on my tail a little bit. And the way that I treated that person and the way that I responded in my heart treated them in no way as a human.
And isn't it crazy how it just pops right up? Like it's living in there.
I can say, never going to do that again.
All
and then
the time.
The next time someone cuts me off, it just boils up inside of me, and things go south quickly.
I don't feel great about this, but the picture of you giving the fury finger to somebody in traffic brings me just a little bit of joy. It does.
Oh yeah. All right. Well, I'll tell Mary to take a picture next time. But
yeah, that'll be,
probably
put that on your Instagram. But
yes,
but it is right, and that's the piece that's scary about us, is that we all have the thing that lives in there.
Yes.
So here's how we talk about it.
We all have a corner that, given the right circumstances, is going to be exposed. Right. And I think that's the fear inside so many people, is that we can't let those circumstances happen, and so we have to control our world so that we're never in the spot to where that closed off room is ever exposed.
Exactly. And it's even more complicated than that, because of the way that so as people, we have this remarkable design. Like, we're designed by God in a magnificent way. And one way I describe it to people is I say our brains are like ice cream cones. So we got this whole brain, but the stuff we really want is at the top, right? This is like there's this part of our brain, and it thinks and it dreams and it plans for the future, and it can evaluate and say, I should probably do this and not do that. And it can say, yeah, now that I'm sitting here with headphones on talking to some dude in a different state, probably shouldn't have flown the finger at that guy, right? It's this part of our brain, and we love that part of our brain. And especially in the church, we love that part of our brain. And what we want to do is it's like we want to smush our ice cream cones together, like my perfectly clear, directed thought patterns to yours and whatever. But that's not how it works, right? Because the way our brains aren't like ice cream cones is they're impossible to get to from the top. Everything that comes into our brains comes actually through the bottom. Right, like through your brainstem, through all these amazing structures, and because they exist, you're not having to sit there right now going heartbeat, 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 perspiration, perspiration, more, less. Like, you're not having to do that, right? Because you're this whole person. But what is true is that our brains are shapeable, and they're fundamentally shaped by the lives that we live. So that I guess the waffle cone of our brain is heavily shaped by our life experiences, and it fundamentally experiences my connection with you right now, right? Like, as a person who experienced a lot of abuse, for example, there's like this portion of your brain that kind of monitors alarm. I tend to be more alert, right? I've got a friend, nicest, kindest, gentlest person you will ever meet. If you walk up behind them and touch them on their shoulder, they have this crazy startle response, right? Like, they just launch into battle. Now, they're never going to hurt you. They're never going to, but still, for them, because that part of their brain is still in a dark, abused moment in their past, because our whole heads don't keep time the same way, and there's just so much going on there. So what happens is we experience life, and then life shapes us. And right now, this moment is I'm experiencing this moment through the shaped moments of my entire lifetime, and that's true of everybody.
A lens of so many different experiences, and we all have these lenses on to which we're seeing and we're experiencing life moment by moment, and we're filtering everything through our own lens, which is a different lens that everyone else is filtering everything through. That's why two people can see the same situation very, very different, so differently, and it's like, were you guys in the same room?
Right.
But you experienced it and you interpreted it. It's so differently because you have such different lenses on from life experiences and trauma and hurt, and that you're filtering every interaction through.
Right. So let's say that at some point in your life you've experienced some junk, Okay. And the kind of junk we talk about tends to be massive traumatic moments, and that definitely qualifies. But it's not the only kind of junk that people experience. A lot of times the junk that people experience is 10,000 experiences of their dad coming home from work, walking directly past them and into wherever the TV is, or wherever his office is, or whatever way he avoids engaging in life is, right? Which also, that times 10,000 equals pretty traumatic stuff.
Yes.
So imagine that you're a person who has experienced junk, be it large, really bad things, or just a lot of things that really questions your value,
Added
whatever
up.
it is, that tell a story of you, right? So those things come with emotion. We feel fear, sadness, guilt, shame, anger, frustration, hurt, rejection, loneliness. I mean, 1,000 different things, and probably 900 of the 1,000 aren't good per se. And those things get planted in us, like they're in a very real way. We remember them in our bodies. And one thing that people have in common is we don't like to feel that way. We don't like to feel those kind of things. So what we do is we all develop these mechanisms, these responses. In my work, we call them defense mechanisms, where and we develop them usually through trial and error throughout life. And one that works for you doesn't work for me, and vice versa. So it tends to be a pretty particular cocktail. But these defense mechanisms, like for me, a huge defense mechanism is isolation. Right? So if I start to feel angry, sad, afraid, my go-to experience in that is disconnection, right? And lots of bad things can come from that. And the experiences can be very particularized. For some people, their defense to feeling their feelings is aggression, right? Man, if you want to be famous on TV, just make sure that aggression, like verbal aggression, is your defense anytime you feel wronged, afraid, injustice, whatever, right? And not only verbal aggression, but people can become incredibly abusive, incredibly hurtful. Very often, a common defense mechanism is sexual expression, right? This is where porn comes into the game. This is where masturbation comes into the game. This is where all sorts of different kinds of sexual expression come into the game that are not subject to subject interactions, that are not me.
And so it's disconnected from reality. It's trying to have, at this feeling of manhood without having to show any strength. It's trying to have this comfort and connection without the risk of actual intimacy.
Right.
And so we can have this instant soothing and covering up what's going on there without going through the process of actual relationship.
Right. And the thing
sacrifice that takes.
And the thing is, it works because in the moment it accomplishes the task of, for that moment, I'm not afraid. For that moment, I'm not ashamed. I'm not alone. I don't feel it. It works in the sense that it resolves that temporary emotional experience. But the deal is there's no such thing. Go ahead.
Yeah. Just let's explain more and about how trauma in someone's past affects their relationships and sexuality right now, and how we can't just look at their behavior right now, but it's connected to a story that's been written many times by others that includes trauma. Like, let's look at the kind of the big picture there.
Absolutely. So let's say that you experience in your past a lot of neglect. And what I'm not going to do, we tend to love to create like stories and then put people into them. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to say everybody who experiences a certain kind of sexual brokenness has experienced a certain kind of past, whatever. I don't believe that. I think the story is much more full than that because every person is unique. But let's say in your past you experienced a ton of neglect, that people who loved you or who were there, supposed to be there to love you and invest in you, whatever, were somehow emotionally at least, and maybe in other ways also unavailable. So let's just leave it there. Let's not even pile on, forms of physical, sexual, emotional abuse of other kinds. Let's just say just that the people who were supposed to be there to fill you up didn't, for their own reasons, right? So you feel this loneliness, you feel this disconnection, and that's your experience in life. And somewhere along the way, you figure out that through some sort of, sexual release, for a moment at least, you feel less of that. Okay? The problem with all defense mechanisms is that they're not perfect. If there was such a thing as a perfect drug, a perfect defense mechanism, whatever, we would all eventually find it, and then we'd be okay. Whatever we do, whatever thing that resolved those experiences, and there would be no bad thing following, right? But all these defenses, they have consequences, and one of the consequences is that they don't work for long. So you have to do more of a thing or different of a thing, because that's how we're wired, right? Most of us, if your go-to is that you discovered once that if you came home from a hard day of work and you drank a beer, you felt better, right? Turns out after a year of that or a week of that or whatever, one beer doesn't do it.
It takes
anymore.
3 of beers to make you feel better.
And behaviorally, the exact same thing is true, especially when guys come to me with confessions of porn or different kinds of sexual struggles. The story's always the same, right? They say, well, I picked up this at whatever point in my life, and it just grew, and it grew, and it grew, and they feel all this shame because they're like, I didn't want that. I didn't want it. I didn't want to be the person who goes to work and spends 6 hours a day watching porn instead of doing my job. I didn't want to be that person. Like, I don't even like it anymore. I just do it. All those kind of stories. And the reason that's true is because that's how it works when you're just trying to defend yourself from your own life experiences. When you're trying to defend yourself from feeling how you feel, you end up in this crazy cycle where your defense mechanism is just the consequences pile up, and the benefits get smaller and smaller, and you're stuck. And that's how you end up, in my opinion, at a brothel in Mexico.
Yes.
Not because you were born a monster, and not even because in this moment you're particularly a monster. The crazy thing is those guys you're talking about who go down and fund that horror, right? Who participate in that evil. I would not be surprised if some of them are Sunday school teachers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it tends to be that the more committed we are to a pure shell, the more space we create for our inner darkness to really, really grow.
There's such a dissonance between what we're presenting and then some area of darkness inside of us.
Right. That's how inauthenticity works.
Yeah. When I was involved in that area of ministry, I stopped doing that for several reasons. I felt like I was not the right person. There needs to be full-time people down there who know the language, who can do a much better job, and that's not what I was called to. But then I also realized I was in college ministry at this time, and at the same time I was dealing with the human trafficking situations. I seen a situation in Nebraska, very close where I lived, where a mom was prostituting out her 2 daughters, like one 14 and one like age 7, and there was, I think, 9 men arrested for being their customers. And so I'm really good at internet stalking people. And so I did all this research, and I realized, like, out of those 9 men, I think that's like 6 of them at one point were college students on the campuses where I have ministries. Like, it's like, I really thought about that. It's like, what if they had been reached in the gospel while they were in college? And obviously my context at that time in life was college ministry. That was my mission. It's like, how could this story have been different if they had had a place to confess that, hey, I'm addicted to pornography? What if the gospel had intervened in their life much sooner, before it got to the point of they're paying a mom in small town Nebraska for her 7-year-old daughter? What if we had had a space for them to work through their sin, their trauma, their darkness, their secrets, long before it got to that point? And that really resonated with me, that it's like, man, like, I am doing something about human trafficking by making disciples on the college campus, by sharing the gospel with my neighbor, by investing in my community and loving the kids who don't have a dad, loving the single mom and helping give more structure to and stability to her family. That is rewriting people's stories so that the story doesn't end with them in Mexico in a brothel.
Right.
And so, can you give us? Let's just end with two thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. In light of all this, what are some steps that individuals can take to start opening up some of the doors in the scary hallway to places that we've been hiding, and making some of those connections? So, one, individuals, what steps can individuals do? And then I know that a lot of our listeners are pastors, people in ministry. People are listening because they want to be equipped. So let's end with a word on how can pastors and church leaders take some steps towards a different culture in church where people can deal with their junk and deal with their trauma, and start to close the gap between what's seen and what is actual reality.
Absolutely. So sometimes when I speak places, I do this thing. I say, okay, this is a flashlight, it's a pretend flashlight, and I have all the crowd. I'm like, when I shine the flashlight at you, you just raise your hand, right? And I go like this and shine it all around, and they all raise their hands and then put their hands down. And the point in that is, at the end of it, I say, here's the thing. I just shine light on everybody in this room, and the whole time I was in the dark. And a lot of times our vision for these areas are exactly like that. Like, if you don't struggle with sexual brokenness particularly, and you envision a world where less people struggle with sexual brokenness, whatever, that's great. But what is required is more than that. Like the vision that you have has to be more like a light bulb than a flashlight. It's got to shine on you too. So I think the first thing,
lighten up the entire room and not shine on certain people,
and specifically yourself, that the first thing that you need to do is you need to become yourself truly. So if I'm listening to this podcast, and regardless of what junk I'm carrying or not carrying, one of the questions I would like for people to walk away from is to answer this question: who in this world do I trust? And what would it be like to have more full conversations with them? This is such a big deal to me. My son and I just designed a phone app to help people have this conversation.
Yeah, you should tell us about that.
It's still free online. It's called the Good Talk app. Good Talk, one word. It's on Apple Store and Google Play. If you just put in like Good Talk Mick Thornton or something like that, it should just pop right up to the top. But even if you just put it in as one word, it should just pop right up to the top. All it is 4 questions and 4 emotions, and at the end of it, you have the opportunity to email your conversation to somebody you trust. So it's just a journaling process. But I'd say the first step for anybody is to become more authentic with another human being. That's powerful for all healing, all growth. And really challenge those patterns of shame that keep us in the dark.
We just mentioned on a podcast recently that some people say, oh, I'm just a very private person. It's like, God didn't give you that option. God did not give you that option of just maintaining this privacy, because that's not the way he designed us to find life, to find wholeness, to find hope, to find healing in dark places. He didn't design us to do that in a vacuum by yourself.
Right. And I think if a person is in leadership, particularly like a ministry leadership environment, one of the things that I would challenge everybody to do is to become honest about the inherent dysfunction of your situation. That churches are not designed on honesty. They're just not. And a lot of churches are actively designed on dishonesty. That in order for you to sit in the big chair, it is your job to put on some kind of superhero cape that you don't deserve and then run around pretending as if you do. That is really messed up.
And build an image.
Right. It's going to have very negative effects in your life, and it's going to tremendously hamstring your ministry. So if you are a person who has a big voice, if you know, like you're the kind of person who gets to talk to 12 people a week, 1,000 people a week, whatever it may be, I would encourage you to be honest, like authentic about you. And what I don't mean by that, I'm not interested in hearing another illustration about your cat or your kids. Okay? That's not what I'm talking about. I want to know.
You're talking about the deep, dark areas of their heart.
Right. And what I'm not telling you, if you've been blessed with a pretty great life and you were loved by your parents and you're not walking in some secret darkness, whatever, I'm not telling you that disqualifies you from gospel ministry, because I don't believe that. What I am saying is the more honest that you are in your leadership, the more you create space for people to be honest around you. So if you're spending all your time talking about finer points of theology and none of your time talking about how hard life is, if you can go through entire sermons and never once mention an emotion that you've experienced, right, then you're probably off track, in my opinion. You need to know your dark story. I call it your dragon story. Mine is that I'm worthless. You need to know your dragon story, and you need to know what it's like to walk with Jesus when your dragon story is awake and you're flying your finger out your back window at somebody just because they're trying to vie for the same piece of pavement that you are.
Absolutely. And so when you do that, then it means that you're not just speaking to people, but you're inviting them into a different story. You're inviting them into the story of Jesus. That's going to change the story of their life. That's changed the story of your life. You're inviting them into a reality of wholeness and truth and light that is going to rewrite their story.
Exactly, because what you're inviting them into is an interaction, a subject to subject interaction, where God is real and true. And where you are real and true and worthy of his love. If it changes, the thing that changed my story is when I finally came to understand that what the cross meant is that at the worst of my worst, when Jesus looks at me, he sees somebody worth dying for.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
If I'm worth
I don't think
dying
we understand
for,
that at the
that changes
depth of
everything.
Our soul, that when Jesus sees us, he sees someone that's worth dying for. If we understood that, life would be so much different.
Right. And when and if I'm a person who walks into a convenience store and lusts after the 15-year-old girl in the corner before turning around and treating the person behind the counter as some kind of low-functioning robot, and then heads back to my podcast, my Jesus podcast, right? Mm-hmm. It challenges that, because those are not subject to subject interactions. Those are subject to object interactions. So you're treating somebody who Jesus looks at as worth dying for as an object, and that's really messed up. And I think the way you first do that is by acknowledging that to God you are a subject, that you matter, and then expressing that worth into the lives of others also.
Absolutely. Mick, I think that's a great note to end it on. Know that I love you as a brother. I'm encouraged by you. I see hope in your life, and I see you giving hope to others. And I think that you will definitely be joining us again, because I want to have more of these conversations.
I'll look forward to it, Brady.
So, thank you for investing in our people this week, and I have no doubt that it's going to shed some light in some dark places, and people can find healing in Christ. So thank you for joining us on this episode of The Great Exchange, and we pray that as you go throughout your week, you can examine the lies that you've believed and exchange them for God's truth, and in doing so, you can find freedom in dark places that sometimes you didn't even know that you needed freedom from. But go and be encouraged, find hope, and know that Jesus looks at you and sees someone who's worth dying for. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.